Hi everybody, I'm Scott Stewart. I'm with UT Extension and I'm here with Jessica Kraub, a master's student, and Sandy Steckel, who's worked with me a long time. She's an extension assistant, and we're going to talk a little bit about soybean insect management and scouting, kind of like a mini version of a soybean scout school. Every July, with the exception of this year, we've actually do a road show and we go out to soybean fields, growers' farms in various counties and do kind of a field side, how do you scout for soybeans, what are you looking for, insect identification 101. This year being the COVID year, we did that all online. And I say that just to mention a couple of things. We have some really good online soybean information. In fact, there's something we call the Virtual Soybean Scout School, which you can go to utcrops.com, go to soybean and click on it. It's a bunch of short videos. We added one this year. Miss Steckel did a really good insect identification video. A lot of good pictures. Ginger helped with that, really professionally done. I'm glad she did it because I'm moving into a new position, so the next guy is going to have to probably take over some of that responsibility. What we're going to do today is just talk a little bit about soybean insect management in general. I can't train you in 30 minutes to be a professional soybean entomologist or a professional IPM person, but we can get you down the road. Again, some really good resources, but the first thing I'm going to tell you is it takes some experience, takes some training. Some of that you can do on your own using some of those resources, but it also just takes some confidence. But the biggest problem we have with soybean insect management, really insect management in a lot of crops, is people aren't looking. So every year I'll walk into a few fields that get devastated by one insect or another, and they almost always have something in common, and that is nobody's looked at them for 3 or 4 weeks. So the number one thing when you're scouting soybeans is you got to do it. You got to walk through the fields, you got to get a schedule. Usually once a week is pretty good. There's times of the years you can kind of relax. There's times of the year like now where you shouldn't relax because late in the season we tend to see a lot of late season insect pest problems. The other thing you got to remember is, and I'm sure through the rest of the tour you'll hear a lot about soybean growth and development, but what you're looking for changes on the time of the season, and it also changes on the kind of soybean you're growing. So you can grow an early group 3 determinate soybean and it's brown right now, ready to harvest. You can grow a late maturing group 5 soybean, which is really now just hitting its stride, it's filling its pods. So soybean variety can vary tremendously from field to field. So you can't just look at a field over here and assume it's the same way across the road, because literally the indeterminate bean planted on this field may be potted up and have a whole bunch of pods, and this determinate bean may not even started flowering yet. So there's some insects we target during pod fill, things like stink bugs which feed on pods, late season caterpillars that tend to show up in September like soybean looper. We're going to be more aware of those things as we either fill in pods or as we get later in the season. The other thing I'm going to tell you is you need to use your eyes and you need to walk your fields, but you also need to have some standard method of scouting. And in soybean, traditionally what we use is a sweep net, and we'll demonstrate this a little bit later, but it's pretty much standard practice to go into a field, 3 or 4 spots, take 25 sweeps, and that would be 1 sweep through the canopy, and count insects. And depending on if you're working for somebody, if you're doing this for yourself, your record keeping might change, right? So if I'm scouting one of my own soybean fields and I go through there and I don't find much of anything, I'm not even close to threshold, I might not fill out a scouting report, but I'll at least have a mental note there wasn't much happening in there. On the other hand, if I go to a field and I'm really close to threshold, I'm really going to have to buckle down and count, because we do have treatment thresholds that often are based on the number of insects per sweep. The other advantage of doing this, besides using your eye, is it just gives you a good census of what's out in the fields. We did a little bit of sweeping out here, and there's a bunch of insects out there, but there's nothing really close to a treatment threshold. And that's the other thing you got to get used to. There's a lot of things that are in soybean. A few of them can be very damaging if they're at high enough numbers, but a lot of them might be beneficial, or they might just be feeding at a low level and really not cause a lot of injury. So we were out here for a half an hour just kind of picking through and showing, finding the insects that are out in these fields. And I'm just going to kind of talk about some of these things as we go around. Put this guy back in a petri dish. So our number one insect pest year in and year out in Tennessee is stink bugs, and it's a whole complex of stink bugs. The most common stink bug in most of the state is the green stink bug. The adult's green, the immatures, you got to learn to identify the immatures because there's different life stages which can confuse you, and we'll pass some things around. Brown stink bugs are also very common. And then we have a new invasive insect that's getting to be pretty common in this area and also in Jackson called the brown marmorated stink bug. Very common in other parts of the state. You get in the eastern part of the state. It's kind of a unique critter. It seems to like urban areas, so it gets really well established around urban areas first. And again, I'll pass some of those around. All these stink bugs do the same thing essentially in soybean, and really we pretty much count them the same in terms of our threshold. They feed on seed, so they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, a beak, and they insert it into the seed and they inject salivary enzymes, and then they suck up that fluid to get their protein and their other food content. So they're feeding on the harvestable part of the crop. You have other insects that are feeding on leaves. We'd call those indirect pests because they're not feeding on the harvestable part of the crop. But if you get a bunch of defoliation, they can affect seed fill. But I'm going to pass around some stink bugs, and let me take a look at all these in here are actually immature green stink bugs, and you'll notice a couple of small ones in there too. And what you'll find is if you look at pictures, these things do vary as they grow. They change colors. Usually the immature green stink bugs often are going to have yellow, black, or a little bit of orange on them. If you look at the adults, and there's an adult and an immature in here, the adult's pretty easy. It's just a solid green stink bug. That's got an immature in there, and you can see it's got a little coloration to it. The brown stink bug, it's kind of important to know if you've got a lot of brown stink bugs because it's a little bit more difficult to control with insecticides. So you have to be a little bit more selective. And I'm sure we have examples here. So these are immature brown stink bugs. And they're very often kind of pale yellow, pale green to brown. But what you'll notice when you look at them is they don't have a lot of color variation. They're just kind of solid. A lot of people would look at that and say, well, that looks like the immature, that green stink bug right there, but it's actually the brown stink bug. So one of the tricks with stink bugs, everybody can recognize that big green adult with a little practice. Learning the immatures, because 9 times out of 10 when you have a treatment infestation, the population is by far and away mostly immatures from hatch out. I mentioned the brown marmorated stink bug. It's a brown colored stink bug. It's important to recognize it as a stink bug, but the reality is it does the same thing as the other stink bugs, so you just need to count it as a stink bug. It's pretty unique looking, and I don't have all the life stages here, but if you look at these immatures right here, what you're going to notice, first of all, is they're very active. In fact, when they're small, they run around almost like a tick. They remind me of tick-like movement. You'll also notice very distinctly on their undersides, they're kind of whitish colored on the bigger nymphs, and the legs and the antennae are striped. So it behaves quite a bit different than the brown stink bug because they drop when they see you. They're hard to catch. Same thing with the adults. I'll sweep up a brown marmorated stink bug adult and I'll go to catch it and I can hardly catch it. Whereas a brown stink bug or a green stink bug is pretty easy to catch. So this is actually the adult of the brown marmorated stink bug. You'll notice it also has dark and light striped antennae, and you'll also notice its legs sometimes have the white striping just like that. And sometimes it's pretty apparent that they have this kind of checkered board down the sides of their body. But if you open that guy up, he's going to try to get away really quickly. They're just very mobile. And actually, I think right here we have both the brown and the brown marmorated. And if you look at the brown stink bug, you're going to see a little bit of that checkerboarding too. So I don't really like to use that as a character very well because it confuses people. You'll notice the brown marmorated adult's a little bit bigger, but the most important thing to look at for identification, if you look at the 2 brown stink bugs in here, their antennae are just kind of pale colored and uniform. Whereas you look at the brown marmorated stink bug, those antennae are they're a little bit bigger, but they're also that kind of dark and light striped. So, you know, they're like I said, they're pod feeders. We have a threshold of 9 per 25 sweeps. We'll talk about that a little bit. You count all these stink bugs the same. There is a predatory stink bug out there, and I don't have an example of it, called the spine soldier stink bug, which is a brown colored stink bug with spines off his shoulders. We saw a lot of them yesterday. We were down in Lauderdale River bottoms collecting soybean loopers, and they're very common where you have a lot of caterpillars. So that's one you got to make sure you can recognize because it's actually a beneficial insect. So again, a lot of this takes a little bit of practice and experience, but it doesn't take a lot. After doing this with somebody, I mean, my crew works with me all summer. You know, by the end of the summer, they get all the common stuff real easy. They're familiar with it. I mean, there's always something unique out there. I learn a new one every year. So, you know, it's just something you have to do. I want to talk about a couple of other ones, and I think I'll save that for last. I'm going to talk about three-cornered alfalfa hopper, and it's one that I don't consider a very serious pest generally. It's an early season insect pest, but it's present all season. So I'll just go ahead and pass these around. These are actually the immatures. If you notice the immatures, they're kind of small wedge-shaped insects, and they have spikes running down their backs, almost like a dragon. The adults are similar shaped, but don't have the spikes, and of course they're hoppers, so they hop a lot. So what this insect does on seedling soybean is it'll get around the base or the stem, and it takes its piercing sucking mouth part and it girdles it. So it goes around in a circle around the base of these small seedlings plants when they're like that. If that's all that happens, you're good. But very often what happens, particularly where you have thin stands, is that creates a callus or a scar, and if you get a heavy wind, it breaks over later in the season, even as late as this time of the year. So if you have thin stands and you get a lot of that, there's no neighbors holding those plants up, they tend to lodge over. So we'll see this a lot, particularly in our later planted soybean. Later in the season, they're still there and they're still girdling, but they're girdling either higher up on the stem where it's not likely to lodge, or what you see a lot of out there is you'll see this. And you see that dead leaf hanging there, and you'll see this whole leaflet hanging there. And what it's done is it's girdled with its beak around there, and it broke off. There'd have to be an awful lot of that to cause economic injury, and really we don't recommend treating for this insect outside of the seedling stage. Some of the insecticide seed treatments give you some protection from them, but it's not real good. So this is an early season one that we worry about. The stink bugs are kind of that R5, R6 window. That's when those populations occur. So the stink bugs are kind of unique. Usually they build and they start building about R5. I guess I need to talk a little bit about soybean growth and development because it's important. So we have V stages, which are just vegetative growth stages. Depending on the planting date, depending on the variety, whether it's determinate or indeterminate, it's going to go through a vegetative growth stage, and then it's going to start flowering. Most everybody plants indeterminate varieties, which means they start flowering and they continue to flower. So most of these varieties out here, you'll notice the pods on the bottom are more mature than the pods on the top. Some of our varieties are determinate, which means they do all their vegetative growth and then they flower in a very short window, essentially almost at the same time, and then all the pods on the plant are essentially the same age. Once you start flowering, you go to what we call R stages. R stages just means reproductive growth. Starts with R1, which is beginning flower. R2 means you got a lot of flowers. When you talk about either determinate or indeterminate, you use the same scale. What you're really looking at is the top 4 nodes of the plant. And I probably have an example right here we can show you. So the top 4 nodes of this soybean plant, you just start at the top and you count down 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be the top 4 nodes of the plant. And when it's early on and it just started flowering, you got a flower up there, you say it's R1. If you got flowers pretty much all the way up and down the stalk at the time, it's R2. R3 is when you start getting 1/4 inch long soybean pods in the top 4 nodes, anywhere in the top nodes. I'll just skip ahead a little bit, but R5 is what we'd call early pod fill. So what you're going to see with R5 would be pods in the top that are just pretty much flat pods. They haven't filled out at all. This is somewhere between R5 and R6, because R6 is when you have full seed in the top of the soybean plant. And if you rip this pod open and those beans are swollen up and actually touching each other, it's a pretty good indication of R6. That's an important milestone because the plant is quickly starting to get less sensitive to a lot of things. It's less sensitive to stink bug feeding because all the seed are already fully developed. They might reduce quality of that seed, but they're not going to have very much impact on the size of the seed. It's also important for our defoliators because we typically tell people once you get to R6, you have about 10 days where you really need to make sure you don't have too much defoliation. After that point, the plant's actually going to start defoliating itself. You'll start seeing some yellowing in the plant. I'm not going to worry about defoliation if I've got yellowing in the plant. So this is an example of a plant that I'd say is like, we'd call it R5.5, mid-pod fill. It's kind of an imaginary number. R7 is when we'd say don't treat for insects anymore under any circumstances, and that's when you have a mature pod somewhere on that plant. And mature means it's typically going to be brown in color. If it's an indeterminate variety, it's going to be at the base of the plant, because it started flowering here first and it worked up. If it's a determinate variety, it really could be almost anywhere in the plant. They're going to mature about the same time. So we got some other insects to show you. One of the ones I'm getting a lot of calls about right now in some of our later maturing soybean are bean leaf beetles. The adult bean leaf beetle is a defoliator. By itself, typically, it's pretty uncommon you recommend insecticide treatment for it, but I'm actually recommending insecticide seed treatment for it now in a few locations. I'm going to pass them around. It's kind of a small lady beetle shaped beetle that is almost exclusively a foliage feeder. Sometimes they'll feed a little bit on the pods. It's not a very big insect, but you can get sometimes 50, 100 of these things in 25 sweeps with a sweep net in the worst case scenario. They feed mostly on the top of the canopy, and actually it's pretty characteristic feeding damage. And I may shift gears a little bit right now, but if you look at these trifoliates right here, you're going to kind of see these roundish small holes. That's real characteristic of a bean leaf beetle, particularly when it's in the top of the canopy. They'll just do these smaller round hole feedings. Defoliation actually can tell you a lot about sometimes what's in the field. If you contrast that to something like this, where you got big irregular shaped holes, really likely you got some caterpillars in that field. You might have some big leaf feeding beetles like blister beetles or something like that. But that's not bean leaf beetle feeding. That's not the way they do. And there's a little bit of that out there in the field as well, and we'll walk through and look at that. That bean leaf beetle, again, is not what I'd consider a common pest to treat for, but a lot of times we're dealing with a complex. It's a defoliator. It's occurring when we have green clover worms and soybean looper. So we have thresholds based sometimes on bug counts, but we also have thresholds based on defoliation levels to kind of, I guess, account for the fact that we have multiple things out there. So our threshold typically during the R stages all the way up to R6 is 20% defoliation. We'd want to treat anytime we think we're going to exceed it or we have exceeded 20% defoliation. Takes a little bit of practice to judge that, because if it's mostly bean leaf beetles, it may be 20% in those top 3 or 4 nodes and very good low defoliation later, so you have to judge the whole canopy. But it works pretty well. Again, very seldom do you recommend treatment just for bean leaf beetles, but you start throwing in these other things and you might have to make a treatment, and then you have to figure out what insecticide kills the whole complex, and you may actually have to tank mix. I mentioned the brown marmorated stink bug is an invasive insect. I'm going to pass out this one, which is very common now in this part of the state, really anywhere you got kudzu, and it's the kudzu bug. It's another invasive insect. There's mostly adults in there, but there's a couple of larger nymphs. They're a unique insect. They came in from Asia, got started in Atlanta, kind of swept across the southeast, and fortunately, one thing we found out about Tennessee is we're kind of on the northern edge. So the cold's holding them back in the winter. That's helping. The other thing is we found some biological control. We didn't find them. There's a fungus called Bavaria bassiana that has adapted or whatever, but it's really started to hold populations in check. When this thing first came in the Carolinas and Georgia, they'd take 25 sweeps and catch 2,000 or 3,000. There's been years now where they have trouble catching any because of this fungus. And there's some parasites that are attacking them as well too. So we see little outbreaks of them. Last year we had a lot in Jackson. This year it's a little bit less, and I think it's because we had that late freeze this year that actually froze the kudzu back. They've been a little delayed, and it probably killed some of the kudzu bugs as well. It feeds very differently. It's got a beak, and it's mostly going to feed on the stems. Not like a 3-cornered alfalfa hopper where it's girdling, but it's going up and down the stem, and it's sucking the phloem out of the plant, the juices out of the plant, almost like an aphid. Takes a lot of them to cause economic damage, but there can be a lot of them. In fact, we did some tests last year. I think we got about a 10 bushel yield response from making an insecticide seed treatment, and that was a population well over threshold. It's an interesting insect. It starts off on kudzu. I probably should have mentioned that. If there's beans around, it'd go to soybean too, but it's usually coming out March, April. It gets on kudzu, it goes through a generation, and almost invariably about mid-July, they'll mature into adults, and then they'll either infest kudzu or any soybean that are nearby. They're strong flyers. Again, populations can build very rapidly. I mentioned defoliation and kinds of defoliation, so I just thought I'd show some of the caterpillars that can cause defoliation, and I'll start out with the obvious ones right now. Actually, one I get a lot of calls about that is not normally a big defoliator, the salt marsh caterpillars. And they're fuzzy little caterpillars, and they are extremely variable. They're very often white, sometimes pitch black, sometimes they're quite pretty, but they're fuzzy, and their fuzziness varies a lot too. They're real active, but they're strictly defoliators. When I worked in Mississippi, it was more common to treat for these things. We'd get big blow-ups of them, but I don't seem to see that as much in Tennessee. But it's another contributor. I get a lot of calls about them because they're big and fuzzy and noticeable. They don't sting you. A lot of people, when they see a stinging caterpillar, are worried about being stung. I wouldn't have handed it to you without fair warning if that happened, but it's one to look for. Our most common, here's a lid for that, our most common caterpillar pest in the state is actually the green cloverworm. And not that it's a damaging, most common pest we have, but it's the one you find year round, year in and year out, always feeding. And let's see if this is the one. Yeah, unfortunately, there's not very many in this field. We had quite an outbreak of them about 3 or 4 weeks ago. This petri dish right here has 2 soybean looper, and it also has a small green cloverworm. You have to learn to identify these things. The soybean looper has 2 pair of prolegs in the back of its body, but they're both green. They both move with this kind of inchworm movement. So there's some tricks, but if you look at the soybean looper, it has 2 prolegs on the back of the body, whereas the green cloverworm has 3 pair of prolegs. The reason that's important is I can kill a green cloverworm with $1.50 worth of insecticide. I can't do that with a soybean looper. A soybean looper requires much more difficult or more expensive insecticides. Also, the green cloverworm doesn't get as big, and it doesn't do near as much feeding on a per caterpillar basis. This time of year is when we start seeing soybean loopers, if we're going to have soybean loopers, and it can happen very quickly in the worst case scenarios. And because they're such voracious feeders and they're bigger, they can cause a lot of defoliation in a short period of time. So right now, soybean looper would be one of our primary concerns on our late maturing soybean fields. It doesn't even overwinter in Tennessee. In fact, it rarely shows up before early August. You might start seeing a few. It's really kind of a late August, September pest. It's one of the reasons that growers have shifted more to a shorter season varieties, because they can actually miss them at the end of the year by growing a group 4 variety that's pretty early and planting it early. In the old days, which isn't that old, when I started my career, people planted group 5s, they planted group 6s in the South. I mean, they'd just now be getting their legs under them and starting to put pods on, but they'd consistently run into late season caterpillar pests. They also would run into worse stink bug problems, because what happens is exactly what you might think would happen. All those stink bugs also feed on corn and they feed on cotton. Well, that corn's turned brown, the cotton's turning, starting to open up, and they're going to concentrate in what's left, which are those late maturing soybean fields. So this could very well be, and probably likely is, soybean looper feeding. There's not a lot out here, but there's enough to cause that level of damage here and there. Same with this, and there might be 2 different kinds of feeding on that leaf. They sometimes share. There's some unique ones out, and this is soybean looper again. And again, if you look at it, this one's all inched up. You can actually see right there, kind of towards the back, it's got those 2 pair of prolegs. That's how you tell it. Now, I got to be honest, I've been doing this a long time. I can tell it from here. I don't have to count prolegs, so it's just one of those experience things. They have a different body shape. The looper tends to have a fat butt and a skinny head, put it bluntly, whereas the cloverworm's kind of a equally, I guess, the same width throughout its body. That green cloverworm also has the habit that if you mess with it and you got them on your sweep net, if you poke it, it'll do a break dance. And it wriggles very violently. And I use that a lot on the telephone because I'll get people to call me and they have no clue which one it is. You know, they can't count legs, it's small, whatever. They have an excuse, but that's why you need a hand lens. I'm just going to tell you, a hand lens helps, especially when you get a little bit older. But again, really important to tell those apart. There's a couple of unique ones that we see. Now, I won't say unique. They're fairly common, but I always get questions about them. And I'm going to show you this one in the Petri dish first. This is called the silver spotted skipper. It's named after the moth, which is a skipper butterfly that's day active. If you look at that thing, and that's probably about a third grown, it's got a kind of a maroon color head with yellow eye spots on it. We'll sweep them up occasionally. Again, I don't know if we have any big fat ones up here. But a lot of times you don't catch them real well on a sweep net. But there's a couple caterpillars that have a behavior of rolling up a leaf. There's one actually called the leaf roller. The silver spotted skipper likes to do that. And there's another one called the painted lady. I haven't opened all these, but I can pretty much, so you can see it's webbed itself together. It's essentially made a home for itself that probably protects it not just from weather, but from predators. But if you open this thing up, good chance, there's a little bigger one. There's a silver spotted skipper right there. And you can see all these that are up here. It's pretty easy. We're just walking down the row. Oh, look at that. There's another silver spotted skipper. And they're various sizes depending on how big the caterpillar is. But I want to talk about the Dectes stem borer. And we'll definitely see this if we walk around. So I showed you those plants that were damaged by a three-cornered alfalfa hopper. You know, it's hanging, there's a girdle there. This is different. And what's going on here, and we'll show you a little bit more later, is this leaf is essentially died. Causes a little confusion because when it happens, sometimes it looks like Southern Death Syndrome or something like that, and people might think it's a disease. There's a beetle called the Dectes stem borer. Comes out in June, flies around for several weeks. It lays an egg in this leaf petiole. On the inside of the leaf petiole, the larvae develops inside that petiole. When it gets big enough, it actually moves into the stem and it tunnels in and out of the stem. All that feeding causes very little defoliation generally. The stem feeding, the best we can tell, doesn't cause yield loss. Occasionally, and it's really, I don't know why, but there's certain times or certain varieties, certain planting dates where the plants will lodge at the end of the year. They actually girdle the base of the plant from the inside and they break. That's about the only time you run into yield loss. Because it spends its entire life cycle, except for the adult, on the inside of the plant, it's really hard to manage with insecticides anyhow. So again, the last thing I want to do before we maybe go for a little bit of walk is really stress that, you know, you need to be on a schedule. But again, there's times of the year I'd always tell you to focus your effort. One is early season. And that's not just because of insects, it's because there's seedling diseases, it's because there's too much rain, too little rain, you get very poor stand emergence. So scouting is really important early in the season just to make sure you have an adequate stand. The other time is probably in that window once you hit V4 or 5, which is when you got 4 or 5 true leaves on it, up until early bloom, there's not a whole lot that typically can go bad wrong. But as you get further and further into those R stages, the insect pests become much more consistent. Now, you can't ever really take a break. So you get in some geographies of the state, R1, R2, early bloom, not a common time for major insect problems unless you get corn earworm. Corn earworm comes in when they're blooming and they'll feed on the pods. So not all the caterpillars are leaf feeders. There are some caterpillars that feed on the pods. So again, you got to learn all these things and learn to identify them. But again, the key is to get out there. And I've had a lot of calls where somebody's like, I don't know what this is, but there's a lot of them and they're concerned. I think what we'll do, maybe we'll walk over here since they're talking over there, and I'll bring a sweep net if y'all want to grab a sweep net. We'll demonstrate a little sweeping. But as we walk along, I may point out some of these same things I saw right here. You know, as you're walking through, one of the things when you're scouting is not just running your sweep net, but you're looking to kind of judge defoliation. I would caution you on the edge of the field, be careful, because there's a lot more defoliation typically on the edge of the fields. Some of that's because you have grasshoppers out here that were in all this grass, and there's some other regions too. Sometimes insects just kind of prefer the edge of the field. But I mentioned you got to go to 4 places in the field. Now, normally like a cotton field, I'd say, well, get in 4 good representative spots. Make sure you get out in the middle of the field. That can be really challenging in soybean. You get a big soybean field that's on narrow rows and very tall, you're gonna have to cheat a little bit. You're gonna have to follow a tire track, a terrace or something to try to get a good sample of that field, but the reality is you just have to cheat a little bit because they're hard enough to sweep. And in fact, sometimes I'll show you a little trick that I do sometimes when we can't sweep them, but a lot of times I'll just do this just to get a sense what's in the field. And you know, at least if I'm trying to, well, seems to be a lot of caterpillars out here. Well, I can do that and get the caterpillars and try to figure out what they are. That works pretty well. The problem is our thresholds are not really based on that. So you need to do a more traditional sweep to do that. That's actually a just a happenstance find. But that little white guy is a wasp cocoon. It's a parasite of several of the armyworms. It's called Catesia. You'll see these on a lot of different crops. You'll see them on, if you have fall armyworm in your pasture or whatever. So it's a good guy. The larvae emerge from the caterpillar and pupated. Some of you have probably seen tomato hornworms on your tomato plants. You get those white cocoons all over them. It's very similar, except you just don't get 20 of them or 30 of them like you do on that. But as I walk across the field, you know, I'm looking for defoliation. We'll get out here a little bit and sweep. Here's some of this. That's that 3-cornered alfalfa hopper, you know, where that trifoliate's just hanging. I haven't been paying attention for the dectes, but that's probably one right there. Let's see. Nope. But you'll see, there's another one of those 3-cornered alfalfa hoppers where it just got the 1 leaf petiole. Again, with the dectes stem borer, what you're going to see is a whole trifoliate. There's an example right there, I think, but you just see a dead leaf down at the base of the plant, and I gotta be honest, there's probably one on almost every plant out here. It's not uncommon to see 80–90% of the plants infested with dectes stem borer. Again, defoliation is a real challenge for people initially. The normal thing people do is overestimate defoliation. Actually, if you go to our insect control guide, there's pictures of what 50% defoliation looks like on an individual leaf, but you have to learn to kind of assess it through the canopy. But that's very trivial defoliation. That's, you know, probably 5%. Actually, if you look at this whole field, even though there's a lot of holes, and there's some holes in almost every leaf, if this is more than 10%, I'd be shocked. So people tend to really overestimate defoliation. You know, that's pretty easy to estimate. I think right there you got a chunk of the leaf missing. That's probably 25% of that leaf. Kind of can put it in context right there. But again, you got to look up and down the canopy. And again, insects feed in a different part of the canopy. The bean leaf beetle will often be in the top. That's what a lot of this defoliation is here. The loopers tend to start at the bottom and move their way up as they eat themselves out of house and home. So it's a little bit of a challenge, I won't lie to you, but you have to do that. I was going to get in the sun, but I think I'll just sit right here. This is the best time of the day to scout, in my opinion, is right when the dew's off finally, and it'll never be off here with this shade. But it's just starting to warm up, and one of the things you'll notice is, and there's a brown stink bug sitting on this leaf right here, a lot of these insects will come up and bask, just like an alligator warming up in the morning. And so you can go out early in the morning and you'll see more things. You'll actually catch more things with your sweep net. In fact, I'll tell people, if you go out at 3 in the afternoon and you almost hit a threshold of stink bugs, you probably have a threshold of stink bugs, because I've done it. I've seen it change dramatically. I can tell you stories about it. When it's 98 degrees, those bugs are doing the same thing you're doing. They're trying to get in the shade, and they move down in the canopy, and they're harder to sweep. But if you're going to take a sweep through the canopy, again, it's the same thing regardless of row spacing. Essentially a 120-degree arc. You take a decent step, and then you do another one, and it's back and forth, and you get the technique of just kind of letting this roll right there. In fact, when we do a lot of sweeping, I'll start to get a blister sometimes right here. But that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's all there is to it. If it's really thick beans, sometimes people will do sets of 5 or 10 because it's kind of hard to keep your momentum going. And I think that's a pretty good little pro tip in those circumstances. And I mentioned you go to 4 spots, and you know, I caught that brown stink bug, and that's the only thing I caught. But there are times with experience you can kind of learn to cheat. And I hate to say it that way, but that's what it is. You know, if I've got the same variety planted in 3 different fields on the same day, and I go to the first 2 fields and I don't hardly catch a bug, I can be pretty confident the third field's probably not going to be eaten up with insects. So I can go, I may not do 4 spots of, you know, 25 sweeps. I take 1 spot and say, this is the same. Also, there are times, and it's happened many times in the career, our threshold is 9 stink bugs per 25 sweeps, and I caught 25 on 25 sweeps. I'm pretty sure I'm above threshold on a field, right? I go to the next one, it's the same. I go to the third one, again, same variety, planting date. I'm probably going to make my decision real quickly. And really, I might just be scouting to look for other things. So there's also always some weird things that happen. You might see a patch of blister beetles and things like that. So that's one of the real benefits of scouting, is to collect, or I guess really find those rare events. I think with that, I may kind of just shut up and ask if there's any questions. We're probably running out of time. How many people here are actually scouting beans occasionally? How many are going to? We got one.
I came across, there's corn in the field now, but cattle run when the corn's out. And we were cleaning off the electric fence row. A giant brown stink bug. I mean, it looked like a stink bug, but it was massive. There were 2 of them. And, you know, all I could think of was, thank goodness I've got my gloves on and what else is under here. But, you know, I wish I could have just grabbed one and stuck in my pocket, because it was, I would say it was close to an inch long.
Yeah. So there's, you know, there's some of the leaf-footed bugs that people will describe as stink bugs. I don't think they look like stink bugs, but I'm a professional entomologist, you know, so to me it looks like another family, but they're closely related, and a lot of people will say, I think it's a stink bug. So again, and sometimes like that insect right there in cotton, I tell people count them as a stink bug, because they actually do the same kind of feeding damage. Usually not enough of them to matter, but it does matter occasionally. So again, you can't replace, you know, 30 years of experience and just expect to go into a field and know it all right away. But I tell you, it doesn't take long before you step into the field and say, there's something different here than what I've seen, or there's way more defoliation. And again, the biggest problem we have is people not looking. It's not, you know, I mean, people call me all the time, and that's, you know, and they're like, you have to almost learn the person when they call you. They say, one guy will say, I've seen a few stink bugs. That means he literally saw 3 stink bugs all day. The other guy might say, I've seen a few stink bugs, and that means it's eaten up with stink bugs. And so, you know, I've learned over the years, I have one guy, I say, well, I just give whatever number you tell me, and I divide it by 2. Because he finds everything, he's very thorough. You know, another guy says, I got a couple of stink bugs and they're everywhere. And so, you know, you got to kind of learn to adjust when you're dealing with folks. But when you're doing it yourself, I think just that experience, you know, you'll figure out, well, this is a lot and this is a little bit. Yeah. And, you know, one of the advantages of soybean, and I didn't mention that, one of the biggest advantages of soybean is we're not supposed to be spraying it every week, every 2 weeks. Often we won't even spray a soybean field. We just don't have enough insects in it to worry about. I'd say the average soybean field probably needs 1 insecticide application a year. You know, if you're spraying it 3 or 4 times, you're doing something wrong. If you're never spraying, you're doing something wrong. But, you know, you got to keep that in mind. And it's one of the challenges of it, because when you don't spray a field, you start finding all kinds of stuff, you know, and people worry, they obsess over the little stuff sometimes. And it's like, you know, look at your stink bugs, look at your defoliation, you know, make sure you're out there. Don't miss the obvious stuff, because there's probably 2 or 3 pests that account for 90% of our spraying. Again, I'll emphasize, very few fields probably need 2 or 3 sprays. You're far more likely to need to spray a late maturing field than an early maturing field, just because insect populations build during the summer. They also tend to funnel into what's green at the end of the year. This is a time of year I have a real challenge getting people to scout, they're busy harvesting their corn, they're trying to defoliate their cotton, and those late beans sometimes seem almost sacrificial. You almost can't get a guy to spray them, and I'm like, man, this is the one field all year you probably really needed to spray. But